So why not do the full El Salvador idea where you continuously allow pesos to be valid until they essentially go out voluntarily?
That's one option. The reason why you may want to think for Argentina to, if cross this threshold and go to the Ecuadorian style and you have to remove the pesos, is to close as many doors as possible for the government in Argentina to go back and issue pesos. Argentines' governments can be very creative.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. We have done episodes previously about dollarization, and this is another one. However, in this case, we are going to finally get into the really nitty-gritty technical details to properly understand the mechanics of how to go about dollarizing a large country like Argentina. To do that, we are joined by Nicolás Cachanosky, who is an associate professor at the University of Texas at El Paso. This was one of my favorite episodes. I really enjoyed it. It's a bit nerdy when it comes to monetary economics, but I'm sure you will enjoy it too. So let's dive in. Hello, Nicolás, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me.
I want to discuss the dollarization process in Argentina from a more technical, details-oriented perspective. On this podcast last year, I did an episode with Emilio Ocampo, who is your co-author on your very great book, Dollarización, una solución para la Argentina. And we have the background about why it's good and some of the basic theoretical critiques about dollarization. But I do want to dig in deeper to figure out, okay, we agree, let's do this, but how exactly do we do this?
That's a question that comes up a lot. Fine, but how you do it? Because you can agree that may be a good idea, but that doesn't mean you can do it. Something to keep in mind is dollarization. What's dollarization, right? You are basically doing away with your own currency and you replace it with a foreign currency. In the case of Argentina, that will be the US dollar. So we're talking about major surgery here. This is not a minor policy change. So that's why there is so much attention. Okay, but how you do it and do it safely? So the way I try to explain this is to divide what needs to be dollarized in three different groups or areas, just to conceptually identify the different approaches that you are going to have to get. Dollarization is not like a one-size-fits-all countries. Different countries dollarize different ways. Ecuador dollarizes differently than El Salvador, different than Panama, different than Zimbabwe. So each country needs to adapt how you're going to dollarize to your needs and your objectives. So what are the three things, the three areas that you have to dollarize? One is bank deposits. Another one is the currency in circulation, so the peso bills that people have in their wallets. And the third one, and this is very particular for the Argentine situation, are the central bank liabilities, which are denominated in pesos. So before I go into each one of these three, let me clarify that when you are changing your pesos or your local currency for the US dollar or whatever currency you're going to be dollarizing to, you need to decide your conversion rate, like what exchange rate you're going to use to dollarize. And this is a very hot topic of debate in Argentina because many of the critics say you don't have enough dollars to dollarize, therefore the only way you can do it is at an exchange rate that is so away from what you have right now that this requires such a currency depreciation that is not doable. So conceptually speaking, if you dollarize at the exchange rate of equilibrium, you don't dollarize at any rate. Of course, if the market rate is, 800 pesos to dollar, you're not going to dollarize 8,000 to $1, right? That's out of the question. So that's pointless. So the concept is, if I'm in Argentina and I get my, wages paid in pesos at the end of the month, and then I go and I buy dollars in whatever way I can, because if the government is not selling me dollars and I need to go to the black market, it doesn't matter. When I get my pesos, that's equivalent to a certain amount of dollars I can get. If you dollarize, when you get paid your wage, you get the same amount of dollars. So that's conceptually speaking the exchange rate around which you are going to dollarize. Maybe you do it a little below, a little above, whatever, but the point is that you dollarize around your equilibrium rate. Okay, so having clarified that, let's start with the first one, bank deposits. This is the area that is maybe the fastest and easy to dollarize.
Sorry, before you do that, could we give some more detail exactly about how you determine the equilibrium rate? Like what would have to be done for you to be satisfied that the equilibrium rate has been reached?
Argentina has a capital control, or at least it had before. The capital controls are still there, which means if you're in Argentina and you want to buy dollars, you can't. You need a government permission. The reason for that, why we have that, is because the official exchange rate is way off of equilibrium. So there is a shortage of dollars. The central bank starts to run out of dollars because they are cheap. And so instead of adjusting the price, they restrict the quantity. That's a capital control. Something that needed to happen, whether you dollarize or not, and this is something to keep in mind, right? Argentina needs to do a number of things regardless of whether they dollarize or not. So one of the things that needed to happen was to adjust the exchange rate, the official exchange rate. How you decide at which rate you dollarize? One way is you try to make an estimation, and you use your estimation as your guide at which rate you dollarize. I know the exchange rate is out of equilibrium, but my team of economists estimate that the equilibrium rate will be 1,000 pesos, and then you dollarize at that level. Another way is to remove the capital controls and let the market tell you what the equilibrium rate is going to be. In that situation, you have the market feeding you some information. Now, some people may react that, but this implies a big depreciation of the peso, and that can be very costly. And once again, that needs to happen even if you don't dollarize. This is not a dollarization problem. This is a peso problem, whether you dollarize or not. And that's what we saw, right? Milei took office, and one of the first things they did was a very big depreciation of the peso. The capital controls are still there, and dollarization was not announced. So that goes to the point that this currency correction, the exchange rate correction, needed to happen with or without dollarization. So those are the two basic approaches. You try to estimate where the equilibrium is, or you remove the capital controls if you can, and you let the market tell you where the equilibrium rate is.
And which would you prefer, the capital control elimination or estimation?
It's tricky because one of the problems that Argentina has are these central bank liabilities, which are short-term debt that the central bank issue that can very quickly go to the exchange rate market to buy dollars. You may have to maybe find a combination if you are afraid that the market may run to the exchange rate markets faster than you announce dollarization. That's one of the tricky parts of how to dollarize Argentina. And that's an area that in our proposal, we pay special attention of how you deal with the central bank liabilities, because you can't ignore them.
Right, I will definitely get to that pretty soon.
And my understanding is that the reason why the Argentine government haven't removed the capital controls yet is because they're afraid of this. So they're trying to clean up these central bank liabilities before they remove the capital controls. But besides these problems, I mean, they're important. I'm not saying they're not, but I want to conceptually explain how dollarization happens through these buckets. So when you're thinking about the bank deposits, this is probably the fastest and easiest to dollarize because you set, however you do, you set your dollarization rate, and then I log in tomorrow online to my bank account and my peso deposits were transformed at the conversion rate into dollars. Before dollarization, if I were to withdraw all my deposits and buy dollars in the market, those are the dollars I was going to get anyway. Now, all my deposits, everything in the banking system is dollarized, and that happens fast, because it's just a change in the unit of account in your bank deposit. Now, the concern with dollarizing the bank deposits is, what if you have a bank run? You're now telling the Argentines that their pesos in the banks now are dollars. What if they go to the banks with the intention to withdraw the dollars and keep the dollars out of the banks? Because we know Argentina, everyone is afraid of the banks, untrustworthy of the banks. Given that these are dollars, they are safer at my home than at the bank. There are a few reasons why, if you are dollarizing, which dollarization is a necessary component of a set of reforms, it's not intended to replace other reforms. We see it as something that you have to do, but it won't be sufficient to fix the country. So some reasons why a massive bank run will be unlikely in Argentina. I'm going to give you a few, but one is what happened in Ecuador, which dollarized in a similar context, political crisis, getting out of a banking crisis when they dollarized. What is an inflow of money to the banks, not an outflow, even if banks were offering a negative real return on those deposits. So the little empirical experience we have points to the opposite direction. And even if empirical evidence is little, that doesn't mean you can ignore it, right? I still have to see what happened in the little evidence we have. But there are other reasons. If you look at Argentine banks, most of the deposits are for transactions. These are transactional deposits. I need to pay wages. I need to pay my suppliers. I need to pay taxes. I need a bank account to collect my proceeds from sales. So this is money that I need in the bank because I'm using the banks as a payment technology. I need to transfer money and receive money. So even if I take the money away, I will have to put it back in the bank so I can pay wages for my employees and my providers and so on. It's not money that is sitting in the bank making financial investments and now I need to take it out and buy dollars. No, I need to make these transactions. Even if that money goes out, it will have to go back. Another reason is that if you are taking the money away, without the intention to put it back in the bank, you don't have the money in the banks, so now your purchases are going to have to be in cash. But you won't have small change in dollars in Argentina at the beginning of dollarization. You only have large denominated bills, $100 bills, that's it. So you are going to need, and you're going to want, if you use cash, pesos, so that you can do the small change purchases with pesos. Now, if you are in the dollarization process, you don't mind that you have the pesos because it's already at a fixed conversion rate. You know that value is fixed, and you can very easily convert these pesos into dollars. One way is you make a bank deposit, because if dollarized, that deposit will become dollars. Another way is you pay your taxes in pesos, and once your taxes go to the government accounts, they will become dollarized. Another way to get rid of those pesos is you give them as a payment when you make a purchase, and the business person don't mind getting those pesos because he knows he can use it to pay taxes, or he can put it in his business account and it will be dollarized. Having a small change cash in pesos won't be an issue. So even if I want to withdraw money, and the assumption is I want to take the money and not put it back in the bank, and then I need to use it for paying purchases, I will need pesos because I won't be able to use the dollars. Another thing that banks can do is, I don't have all these dollars you want, but I can give you these Visa cards with the amount you want to withdraw in dollars already charged in the card, and you can swipe it and the payments will go through. And this is good for you. One, it's more pragmatic. You don't have to be around with the dollar bills. You just have one card. And two, it's more safe, because if the Visa card comes with a PIN, then there's no point in stealing the Visa card from you, but I can steal the cash from you. So it's safer in a place like Argentina to have a card that a thief cannot use than having the dollars as a temptation for anyone. The reform also includes a banking reform to improve the safety of your deposits. So the idea is to have a private bank in an international jurisdiction. In the book, we call this Argentine Reserve Bank, whose only mission is to be custodial and protector of private bank reserves. So I make a deposit in my bank in Argentina, but the reserves are not held at the central bank. They're held at a bank in Switzerland or Ireland or New Zealand or somewhere else where the Argentine government has no jurisdiction. One of the features of this is that now it's easier and faster for me as a depositor to move my money away from that bank than it's for the government to ask the banks to bring the money back and then seize it. I can go into my phone, and with a couple of clicks, I can move my money around from my bank in Argentina to somewhere else, and now the government cannot do it. So because the public can move faster than the government, that works as a defense mechanism against these expropriations. Now, there are other couple of items that will be more clear when we talk about the central bank liabilities, but through the dollarization process, when the central bank is liquidated, you have a way to provide some dollars to the banks if needed.
Before you go on, the idea of the international private bank outside of the jurisdiction of Argentina, could you give some more details on why that's a necessary component?
I don't see it as a necessary component of dollarization, but I see it as a value-added component, especially for Argentina. This idea came out of seeing how dollarization took place in other places. In Ecuador, Rafael Correa mandated the Ecuadorian banks to bring the money back to Ecuador, and it had to be deposited at the central bank. And then Ecuador said, give me those dollars, central bank, in exchange, take this treasury bond. And Correa was able to seize a lot of money from commercial banks that way. So that's why, for Argentina, which has so weak institutions, the proposal is, one, you have to shut down the central bank, because now makes all this process much more difficult, and two, have the custodial of the reserves outside the country, and that's not a normal. Ecuadorian banks were having their deposit outside of Ecuador. So what we are saying is you can have one bank just dedicated to this. It's not out of the common. And in Zimbabwe, when Zimbabwe de-dollarizes and they go back to 3-digit inflation, they use a similar process through the central bank in Zimbabwe. In my view, to keep the central bank, if you are going to dollarize, especially in Argentina, is to take an unnecessary risk. You don't need to have a central bank if you're dollarizing. We know that from Panama, for instance. Panama has been dollarized for more than 100 years and it never had a central bank. You don't need to have a central bank if you're dollarized. For Argentina, we see it very risky. And in Ecuador, they had problems with that. Once you dollarize your bank deposits, the amount of dollars, cash, physical dollars that you need is actually not that much, but what you need to change is the reserves in pesos for dollars. But you don't need to change all the nominal amount of your bank deposits because that's digital money. Now, if you're going to have a bank run, of course, you need more dollars, but the point is that likely, and as was mentioned before, it's not very likely for Argentina, and you have some ways to still deal with that. That's the general approach for bank deposits. Conceptually, besides the challenges of the bank run or not, how to do it is easy. easy. Just switch from pesos to dollar the conversion rate, and the central bank will take the pesos in the bank reserves and transform that into dollars, which is not a large amount. The other component to dollarize is what do you do with the currency in circulations? In Argentina, there's a lot of pesos in the hands of the public. So there are different ways to deal with this. For instance, Ecuador, they give originally like a 9-month period within which the sucres had to be changed for US dollars. After those 9 months, the sucres are not valid anymore. So the central bank has to change those currencies in 9 months. The first point to note is that when you dollarize your circulation, that doesn't happen overnight. It's not that Argentina announces dollarization and tomorrow you're going to have a line of 40 million Argentines at the doors of the central bank waiting to change their pesos. This is going to take a number of months. So you don't need all those dollars on day one. You need them through a large number of months. El Salvador did something different. El Salvador said these colones, they don't lose validity. You want to dollarize them? Make a bank deposit. Pay taxes. So if your currency, the peso in Argentina, is not going to lose validity, the central bank is not obligated to change them for dollars. They can say, in theory, the central bank, those are my pesos. They are valid forever. I'm not need to buy them for dollars. If you want to make them dollars, make a bank deposit, pay taxes. So in this case, you don't even need dollars to change the currency in circulation. And you see this in Ecuador. I mentioned before, when they announce dollarization, you have an inflow of money to the banks. So if you look at the Ecuadorian central bank reserves, as currency circulation is going down because it's being dollarized, Ecuadorian central bank reserves is not going down. Deposits are going up. So there was a large amount of the dollarization in Ecuador that took place through the private sector, not through the central bank. In Argentina, you can do a combination of these two approaches. You can say, okay, we are going to start, let's just make round numbers, with the peso. It's not going to lose validity, but in 12 months from now, we're going to see how many pesos in circulations are left. So if the amount of pesos in circulations falls below a certain threshold, I don't know, 30% or whatever number you choose, there's like an automatic referendum. Okay, the public voted, they don't want the pesos. So now, 1 year from now, you switch to an Ecuadorian style where the dollarization of the currency is mandatory, and now the central bank has 1 year, let's say, to change the remaining pesos for dollars. And that gives you an important advantage. One is, or two, the central bank doesn't need to have the dollars to dollarize today. It can wait 1 year to increase its reserves. Two, the amount of pesos they will have to dollarize is much less than the initial amount on day zero.
So why not do the full El Salvador idea where you continuously allow pesos to be valid until they essentially go out voluntarily?
That's one option. The reason why you may want to think for Argentina to, if cross the threshold and go to the Ecuadorian style and you have to remove the pesos, is to close as many doors as possible for the government in Argentina to go back and issue pesos. Argentines governments can be very creative in how to seize resources from the public. And let me make a parenthesis here because you are referring to something important. Most people think of dollarization as an end game. You dollarize, boom, you're done. I see more dollarization as a potential bridge. The fact that you dollarize doesn't mean you cannot de-dollarize. It's difficult, of course, but it's not impossible. Zimbabwe de-dollarized in a bad way, but the point is that to de-dollarize, if you remove the pesos and you need to launch a new currency, you have to be credible. If you are not credible, you cannot de-dollarize. That happened to Korea. Korea tried to issue its own digital currency and he failed because he's not credible. Dominicana, I think, when they de-dollarized, they were credible and they had a lower inflation rate than the US. Something that dollarization gives you is like a separating equilibrium. You're a bad actor, it's very difficult for you to de-dollarize. You are credible, you may be able to de-dollarize. So let's say that Argentina wants, and would be better, I don't know, just for making the argument, to have, this is one of the proposals, to have convertibility with the Brazilian real, I don't know. Or pick any monetary regime you prefer over dollarization. Like currency competition, have the peso and the dollar compete on equal foot in Argentina like happens in Uruguay and other countries. I think it's easier to get a regime like that, if that's what you want, after you dollarize than without dollarization, given where Argentina is right now. So dollarization can be the regime that opens you the door to get any other monetary regime you may want that today is not possible. It's going to take time, of course, because the amount of credibility that Argentina needs to build is very significant. Daydreaming to think that all of a sudden you can have the credibility and the robustness to have these monetary regimes like with one government, no, it's going to take years. So that's part of reality. But dollarization, I see it as a potential transition to something else, not necessarily an endgame. That's the main reason why I'm thinking if I were to propose this in Argentina, I would say, okay, you can start with El Salvador and I will input in the law this provision, but it doesn't have to be that way. But that's the reason why for Argentina, we feel more comfortable if the harder it is for the government to do these things again. And one of the assumptions that is behind the design of the proposal is that Argentina will, sooner or later, elect again, like many times in the past, again, a populist government. So we need to have a design that will be as robust as possible to a new populist government taking place. And so that's why we're trying to think of all these institutional protections to the monetary regime.
So before you were explaining, let's say after the threshold is reached, you want to get rid of all the pesos out of circulation, how do you go about doing that part?
The central bank or the treasury or whoever is at that moment still present will have to execute a plan to reach out to the market and say, okay, by this time you have to deliver me the pesos and I will give you in exchange the equivalent amount of dollars.
By the way, when you mentioned they've closed the central bank, what do you literally mean by that point? Because, of course, the central bank does other functions besides monetary policy.
The central bank is liquidated, has to be shut down. So the functions that the central bank is doing, other than issuing currency, of course, because you're dollarizing, but those functions can be relocated in other agencies. Financial regulation, that can be done by a new or existing financial regulatory agency. It doesn't have to be done by the central bank. Clearing, you can have a clearing house without the central bank. So all the other things the central bank does, you can relocate them into other agencies. You can use that closing of the central bank to create a new professional, independent from the government agency, if you want as well.
Which happens in Panama.
Yes.
Panama, the Banking Supervision Office does the banking regulations. The clearinghouse is a consortium of there's one state bank plus private banks that run the clearinghouse in Panama. So yes, there are definitely ways to do it without a central bank.
Exactly. And something that you can do that many people in Argentina don't do is to spend a few minutes in Google and find out how this happens in countries that are dollarized. We can go and see. We don't have to just try to imagine this. Okay. An important point I wanted to mention this is that if you go El Salvador way, where you say the pesos don't lose validity, you don't need a lot of dollars to dollarize because you are changing which currency has the legal tender status and you are not obligating yourself to make that change. Okay. You have to fix the rate. Again, you're doing at the equilibrium value, so that won't be a problem for you as a central bank, but you don't necessarily have the money to say, I'm going to change all this currency today. So to dollarize is cheaper than it seems. The third component is, okay, what do you do with the central bank liability? So let me give you just a little background so everyone understands what these liabilities are and why the central bank has them, because it's a little odd unless you know what's going on in Argentina. So a typical central bank, if they want to contract or withdraw some money from the market, a typical central bank will sell in an open market operation some financial assets like treasury bonds. So I'm the central bank, I have bonds issued by the treasury, I need to withdraw some money from the market, I'm going to go to the banks and say, okay, I want to take away 100 million pesos, I'm selling these bonds, who is buying? You buy from me, I give you these bonds, you give me the pesos, I manage how much money is out there in the market. The central bank in Argentina, the treasury bonds they have are non-transferable. So legally, those bonds cannot be sold to the market. So if I'm the central bank in Argentina and I need to take money away from the market because inflation is running high, I cannot sell treasury bonds. I don't have dollars to sell. I don't have assets to sell. So what I'm going to do is issue my own bonds and sell you that. Central bank issues short-term debt, and instead of selling you a treasury bond, I'm going to sell you my bonds. Here's my bond, you bank, give me the pesos. So the central bank started to accumulate a large amount of short-term liabilities denominated in pesos. And this created dangerous expectations because, like any bonds, sooner or later, they're going to be paid off. And these are short-run. So if I'm the bond holder and I don't want to roll over these bonds, I'm going to say to the central bank, pay me in pesos. But inflation is high in Argentina. I don't want to save in pesos. I want to save in dollars. So as soon as you give me the pesos, I turn around and I go to the exchange market and buy dollars. And boom, you have a currency crisis and a spike in inflation even higher. This happened during the Macri government. Now, these bonds, which are called letras de liquidez or liquidity notes, I think they were like 3 months maturity or something like that, but they are backing bank deposits. And remember, the bank deposits are transactional. So if I default on these bonds in any way, if I do like a mandatory swap or something like that, then you as a business manager, you have a problem because all that money in the bank, which is backed by these bonds, now I cannot use them because that bond is defaulted. I don't have the money to pay wages and my suppliers and so on. This is a very delicate situation. You cannot set the banking system down and freeze the transaction payments. So you have to deal with these liabilities. The central bank in Argentina is technically speaking bankrupt, which means if you want to dollarize and liquidate it, you have a problem. If you shut down the central bank, you have a shortfall of dollars, not a surplus. So how you fix that? How you input more resources into the central bank? One way is to say who is the owner, if you want, of the Argentine central bank? That's the government. So the government can issue sovereign debt, collect dollars, give the dollars to the central bank. That's easy to understand. It's easy to see. It's transparent. It's not feasible because Argentina cannot issue debt.
And they can't issue debt because no one wants to buy the debt, correct?
Yeah, who's going to buy Argentine bonds? Unless the market conditions change and for some reason they want Argentine bonds, right now, this is not an option. Or at least wasn't an option. We were working on the proposal, right? We need to find another way. So what's another way? Instead of issuing sovereign debt, I'm the government, I'm going to sell assets I have. So I have these investment portfolios, I have stuff, I can sell it in the market, get the proceeds, send that to the bank. This is a fire sale, and the market size in Argentina is not large enough to absorb a sale like this. So you're going to have a price problem. You can disrupt your secondary market. Again, not feasible and expensive.
So what would you be selling as the government?
What will be one of the things that can be sold is in a few years back, the government nationalized all the private retirement and pension funds. All your, like, if you're in the US, all your 401ks, all that stuff, all your retirement and pension fund investment, equity, stock, bonds, and so on, all that became one big portfolio and office in the government, the office that manages the public pension program. So one option is to get that, sell it in the market, get the proceeds, give the dollars to the central bank. This is costly because it's a fire sale. You're going to be selling at a price that is subpar and it's sold, it's gone. So it's not doable because the market cannot absorb that size of a shifting supply of financial instruments. This leaves with what is proposed in the book and in our blog, which is a structured financial solution. Requires some financial engineering thinking. This has an upside. It allows you to capture an upside in valuation of Argentine instruments. There is no loss for the private or government sector. The downside is that it's difficult to understand. It's a complicated process. And this is where we find most of the issues when we try to explain this. But I'm going to explain it in the easiest way I can for everyone to get the idea of how this works. Conceptually speaking, before I go into the steps, you have these central bank peso liabilities. You can dollarize them in two ways. One is, which is what most people think as a default, you have to go and buy them. I'm going to buy all those bonds and give you the dollars today. Like you dollarize on the spot. The other way is to treat them as what they are. They are bonds. So you pay them off in a sinking fund scheme in a longer period of time. You don't have to pay them off today. So how we do that? I'm going to divide this into steps to separate conceptually how this works. If you execute something like this, everything may happen together or the order may change. But conceptually speaking, I'm going to separate this into steps. So the first step is we need to get these bonds that the central bank has issued by the Treasury that are non-transferable. So the Treasury is going to collect them and it's going to transfer them. It's going to swap them for sovereign bonds issued under New York law that for any intent and purpose can be traded in the market. The amount of that swap is the same. So if the central bank has $100 in these non-transferable bonds, the government takes, give me those $100 bonds and I issue new $100 bonds. So the amount of debt remains the same.
Let me pause you a bit there because I want to clarify why exactly were the bonds Treasury to central bank here Argentina non-transferable in the first place?
Why they were issued as non-transferable?
Yes.
I think the reason was when these bonds mature, the central bank has them, so the Treasury has the option to, instead of pay them, just roll them over. But if they're sold to the bank and say, no, give me the money.
And was that a relatively recent process, or was that a long-term Argentina system?
No, this comes after the 2001 crisis, if I remember correctly. Another reason is that, again, Argentina has a small financial market. So if you have the central bank going to the market and selling these bonds, the price of the bond will fall, the interest rate will go up, and now the Treasury has a higher cost on its debt. So it also has to do with the size of the market in which you will be selling these bonds. The first thing that the Treasury has to do is take these bonds and transform them into standard tradable bonds issued under New York law. And these bonds will be transferred into a trust located outside Argentine jurisdiction. We call this the Monetary Stabilization Fund. I take these bonds, I transform them into tradable bonds. I don't sell them in the market. This is important. These bonds never go to the market. You get them and you put them in the assets of this trust. The other thing that is going to go into those assets, and I'll explain in a few minutes some reasons for this, is other contributions that the Treasury can give to this fund. I'm going to give a few examples. They may be other ones, may not be this one. These are examples to capture the idea. This portfolio of investment I mentioned from that nationalization of the pension and retirement funds, move them to this trust. And this portfolio is going to create payments in dividends and coupons and so on. Other thing that you can transfer is all these export taxes that you as an agricultural producer, you had to pay to the Treasury. A part of that, you give it to this trust, and the remaining, you give it to the Treasury. So if I produce, wheat in Argentina, and I'm going to sell it to the rest of the world, and I need to pay $100 in taxes, I'm going to give, $20 to the trust, $80 to the government. Because it won't be realistic, I think, to assume that the new government will be able to eliminate those taxes overnight, because the government still needs some dollars. Another thing that the government can do is, if I'm going to sell and get proceeds from the 5G network for mobile phones, that proceeds, I can just send them to the trust. By doing this, you diversify with some limits, but you diversify to some extent the source of the cash flow in this trust. Because once you move those bonds there, this trust depends on the government keep paying those bonds. But the coupons and dividends from the portfolio investment, that's coming from other governments and the private sector, so it doesn't come from Argentina. The export taxes come from agricultural producers and other exporters, so it's not the Argentine government. So you diversify to whatever limit you can and you want the source of that cash flow. This is on the asset side of this trust, international jurisdiction outside Argentine government control. Now we have the liability side of the central bank with these central bank liabilities. It's a similar idea. This is short-term debt. So it's going to be, the central bank is being liquidated. We need to change the issuer. The issuer is going to be the trust. And the trust is going to replace these peso short-term notes into short-term dollar notes, like commercial paper. So I'm the trust and I work like a computer. My assets, which has the bonds, the portfolio investment, the contributor from exporters, and whatever I have there, that creates me cash flow. So I collect $20. So I turn around and say, I'm going to pay off $20 on the now dollarized, if you want, liabilities held by, that were issued by the central bank, and I'm going to roll over the remaining. Next year, I get another $20. I turn around to the market, boom, $20, and I keep canceling it down as a sinking fund until there are no more central bank liabilities outstanding. When that happens, by then, if you are serious about dollarizing, doing reforms, and you are reducing the Argentine risk, the market value of those assets have to increase because your discount rate is going down. So once you paid off all these liabilities that you pay with the cash flow, not by selling assets to the market, you have all those bonds, you have all those equities, all that stuff, the trust gets liquidated and all the assets go back to the government. And it gives you two things. One is you created a very big reduction in Argentine debt without having to default, right? Because those treasury bonds go back to the issuer, so they get canceled. And you recover that portfolio that was maybe being misused, but was originally sitting, doing something, whatever that was, at this retirement office in the government. So that goes back there if you want. Maybe you want to send it somewhere else, but it can go back to its original location. And then your dollarization process finished. Now, if we are following this situation, as I mentioned before, when you asked me about why these bonds were non-transferable, and I said one reason is that the government doesn't have to pay them, they can roll them over. But now, these new bonds, the government has to pay them. That's how you're dollarizing. Dollarization is not free. This is how you produce these dollars to cancel this debt. You have to pay your debt. So now the government needs to pay those bonds. And someone may say, but the Argentine government has a very delicate fiscal situation, and now you're having to make them pay all this extra debt? That's not going to work. By doing this, you open yourself the option to manage how that cash flow is going to look. So you can do a couple of things. One is when you transform the non-transferable bonds to the new bonds, you can say, but now the first payment is going to be in 1 or 2 years. So I give myself a grace period to get my balance to fix my fiscal situation and be able to deal with this. What do you do in between? You're getting money from the exporters, the portfolio that you move there, so you're getting some cash flow in the short run. The other thing you can do is you can extend the duration. These bonds, instead of maturing in 5 years, I'm going to make them mature in 7 years. So you have a way to calibrate that cash flow so that the treasury can deal with it. For the public, dollarization is almost like Oh, the US dollar is legal tender. My bank deposits are dollarized. I have pesos cash, but they are fixed at the dollarization rate against the dollar. Prices are denominated in dollars. As a consumer, as a public, I'm already dollarized. Even if for the government, the whole process may take a number of years. It doesn't matter. That's happening behind the scenes. But once you announce dollarization, you make that change.
And how long would you think that sinking fund trust mechanism would actually take to reduce the peso budget of the central bank?
Ideally, I would like it to see the process complete before the end of a presidential term, so you don't have to go through the risk of the new government trying to mess up with this in any way they can figure out. But maybe that's not doable, and maybe you have to postpone it. So how long it's going to take, it will depend, one, when you dollarize, how many central bank liabilities you have outstanding. Two, it will depend on how much you can have the treasury manage these payments that will have to make to the new treasury. It will depend on how many other assets you want to send to the trust. It depends on a lot of variables. But the point is that you have a flexibility to manage that. It's not that if you cannot do it in 4 years, then you cannot do it. Right? I'm giving you an option that if 4 years is too short for you, you can do it in 6 years, 7 years, or how long you want.
And in your idea, who would be the managers of this kind of offshore trust?
This will be an international financial institution working under outside Argentine jurisdiction with a very clear mandate. You work like a calculator. Every dollar that you produce has to be used to cancel off debt. It's like a rule. There is no discretion here. Like you need a manager to make that rule happen, and that's it. And once the last dollar is paid off, it gets liquidated and everything goes back to the treasury.
So I suppose in standard financial markets, this is a pretty standard idea, standard plan, using special purpose vehicles to do similar things. But I can see obviously why in a context of dollarization public policy, it is typically not discussed in those contexts.
I'm sorry, you mean that usually when you hear about dollarization, this discussion is typically not there?
No, I'm saying this part of your plan is a fairly standard financial engineering vehicle that many companies and large banks use. But in terms of public policy dollarization, this is not ever discussed in a sophisticated way.
Yes, that's a very important point. This part of the proposal, if you have some familiarity with international financial markets, there's nothing strange here. Maybe the novelty is that being used in a dollarization proposal, but having these asset-backed commercial papers, there's nothing out of the ordinary here. This is an excess collateral because you have a high exposure to Argentine risk, and that excess collateral, you can use it to collect dollars to send, as I was saying before, to Argentina if you need cash, for instance. You can do all these financial enhancements and credit enhancement and different arrangements to improve even further the risk exposure of this to the extent you can. But yes, you can use standard international financial instruments. So why this is not much of a talk when you hear about dollarization? I think there are maybe 2 or 3 reasons. One is, in cases of countries that dollarize, they didn't have to deal with this problem of central bank liabilities. They didn't need to come up with something like this. Another reason is that financial markets in Argentina are not as complex and developed as international markets. So many of these instruments are uncommon for many economies that work in Argentina. So they're not used to thinking in this. Not that they cannot understand, it's the common tools I'm thinking about how I do this in a place like Argentina. And so it can be confusing. So one of the issues we had is that many critics were thinking that we are proposing to sell the treasury bonds in the market. And but if you sell all those bonds, you're going to make the price go down. And no, these bonds never go to the market. It's just they're backing in the sense that they produce the cash flow to pay off those debts. They are confused like, oh, you want to use the bond as a collateral. No, not exactly as a collateral. This is like a different vehicle. So those kind of confusions happen, but then it leads you to think this is not doable or it's problematic, but that's not exactly how this is working. And another reason is that even if dollarization is a topic of much more interest in emerging economies than, the US, European countries, and so on, it's still a topic not very profoundly studied by many economists. Most of the approach to dollarization is, okay, how do I put this into a standard model? What happens if the exchange rate now if you are dollarized, and what happens with shocks, and so on? But there is no much focus in the implementation part. It's, I need to change the currency base into dollars. What's the exchange rate of that? Yeah, that's a very simple calculation, and it's as simple as misleading, because as we were talking, you don't need to buy the pesos today. Depending how you dollarize, you don't have to buy those pesos. You do the Salvador way. All that simple calculation that steps aside of all these considerations is what most economists typically think of. That's our framework.
That reminds me of this paper that was published by these three MIT Argentine economists. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It was called Dollarization Dynamics by Carabello, Waring, I think, and Bruera. I think those were names. And they made this dollar shortage point in Argentina. You can't do it. It will cause this sudden stop in the economy and so on. And the model, as you said, it was just a very basic static model that didn't give any indication of their analysis of how dollarization has actually happened previously in other countries.
We know that paper, of course, and Emilio and I, we have a working paper commenting on them. One of the things is how they treat the dollar shortage. And again, you have ways to deal with that. And they make absolute no comment in pointing out that you can set an exchange rate without having to have the dollars today. And I'm not making that up in my mind. That's how it happened in the real world. The other interesting thing is that if you compare the projections of that paper with Ecuador, when Ecuador dollarizes, they depreciate their exchange rate. The predictions of the model are backwards to what happened in Ecuador. But there's no discussion in this paper, as far as I remember at least, of these are my model predictions. Let's look at the real case where something more or less similar at least happened. Does the prediction match the model or not, and why? And there is no discussion of Ecuador, and that's one of the things we bring up. I think one of the reasons of why that backward prediction happens is one of the confusions around dollarization. A typical way that you treat dollarization in these models is as a hard peg, like a really strong fixed exchange rate. And I think that's wrong in this sense. Of course, you have some overlap between a fixed exchange regime and dollarization, but dollarization is also an institutional change. It's not just a policy change. One of the key changes is now you have a policy whose existence does not depend only, at least, on domestic politics. That's a very deep institutional change, and as such, it's going to change the behavior of economic actors. It changes expectations. It changes the deep parameters, like sometimes you economists talk about. And therefore, I cannot just take the pre-dollarization model and forecast that into a fixed exchange rate regime, because this is not a fixed exchange regime. You have new parameters here. And I think that's one of the reasons why some of these estimations are off mark.
So one of the other very common objections to dollarization in Argentina in particular is the constitutional objection, if I use that term, in the sense that it is claimed that the Article 75 of the Argentinian Constitution prohibits, it doesn't obviously explicitly use those terms, but it's the interpretation that it prohibits the idea that dollarization could legally happen in Argentina. Do you see that as true?
That's a common concern. It became more prominent after one of the Argentine Supreme Court judges gave a similar interpretation. For me, it was a little odd because typically, if a judge gives an opinion before a case, then he has to recuse himself because he's given in advance how he may rule, right? So I was surprised to see him talking about this. But he also made a mention with a very superficial, simplistic way of how you implement dollarization. So let me first give you what I see constitutionalists in Argentina see in this article you mentioned. Some of them will say, yes, this will be constitutional, but a very large number of other constitutionals says, no, that's not what this article means. I agree with this second group. I explain why, but then I will come back, even if it's unconstitutional, how you can dollarize. So what this article is doing is, first, it's giving the right, not the obligation to the government to issue currency. Two, what the article is giving to the government is the mandate to make sure that the country has a currency. It doesn't have to be the national currency. And I think in Spanish it's something like hacerse echar moneda. So you have to have currency. It doesn't say it has to be your currency. Another historical component is that the time these type of articles, which are not only present in the Argentine Constitution, they are common around Latin America, these articles are before there are central banks. So the whole point is you are creating a new country in this region, you're going through these independencies. You as a government, you need to make sure there is money here that we can use, whatever that money is. That's more aligned with interpretation of the constitutional lawyers that say, if I put this in the table, if I read that it says instead of obligation, that your mandate is to make sure there is a currency, it doesn't have to be your government currency, you can dollarize. And even before going into this debate, when I read that article, that was my reading as well. Oh, this is what it's saying. And it makes time, right? When this was written, this was years before there was any kind of central bank. There were different currencies in Argentina. So one way the government can fulfill the mandate is saying the currency we issue, no one wants it. The dollar people wants that. Here, we are fulfilling the mandate of delivering to the country a sound money or better money than we have. Now, let's say that this goes to the Supreme Court and there's a ruling, no, it's unconstitutional. Argentine government has to issue its own currency. You can still dollarize. Let me explain how you do that. It has to do with El Salvador way. That's one way. You leave the peso in circulation. If you cannot liquidate the central bank, you minimize it the most you can, I don't know, let's say. And the peso is out there, but you also give that we know it's possible because this happened in Argentina before. You give the US, you let contracts be in dollars, you give the dollar legal tender status, and if the market moves to the US dollar, what are you going to do? That's what happened in El Salvador. El Salvador, the colonies went away because the public moved to the dollars. But me, legally speaking, as the government, I'm providing the peso, but I cannot force them to get it, right? Another way, I'm going to shut down the central bank. I'm going to issue this moneda el argentino, and I'm going to put it in a safety box after 7 keys of locks underground. That's my issuance. Legally speaking, I issue the Argentine currency. It's legal tender, but I'm sorry, no one has it. I'm giving an extreme example, but actually Ecuador did something like that. So even if there is constitutional constraints to this, you have a way to still navigate the dollarization. So even in the most complicated scenario, this doesn't mean you cannot dollarize. It just means you dollarize in a different way.
You said Ecuador did something similar to your extreme scenario?
I think they issued like a kind of a commemorative coin. I don't remember the details, but I think they did something like that. Putting it in a safety box on the ground and kind of making that up a little bit. But the point is the concept. I can issue something that has all the legal requirements of international currency, but it doesn't have to be in circulation. And if I put it in circulation and the market doesn't want it and send it back to me, how is that unconstitutional?
Now, the expectation from many people when Milei won the election was that a version of your plan would likely have been implemented, but that was not the case. I don't know if you have anything to mention about why do you think this directional change was, if it was even a directional change, because Milei still says the dollarization is on the table, but there's no indication really that it's going to happen anytime soon.
Before whoever was going to win the elections, there were 3 possible scenarios. One scenario is that you take office and you dollarize as soon as you can. That would be my preference for a number of reasons. Another scenario is that you dollarize later because you want, for instance, to balance your budget before dollarizing. And another scenario is that you don't dollarize. You just try to keep the peso alive. When he mentions that he wants Emilio Campo to be the next and last president of the central bank, the expectation is, okay, he's going to dollarize sooner instead of later because that's what the proposal and that's what he's appointing Emilio for and so on. As we know today, that did not happen. So now we have this new policy basically by Caputo and Bausili. Caputo is the Minister of Economia, Bausili is the central bank president. And if you look what they are doing, that's consistent with saying they want to dollarize but later, but it's also consistent with trying to keep the peso alive. So now it's up for everyone to decide, what do I believe? Does he really want to dollarize, or is dollarization just a political campaign to attract votes and support? It's hard to know for sure. It depends how much I feel I believe him. So I want to make that clear, right? Some people strongly believe he's going to dollarize. Some people have more doubts. I'm more like, I know his actions are consistent with both, so there is rational room to have these doubts. So the issue with waiting dollarize is that the scenario that in my mind is the most likely to play out, assuming Argentina dollarizes, is that one similar to Ecuador in the sense that Argentina dollarizes because there is no way out of a very serious crisis. The Congress has no idea what to do. They throw the towel, they dollarize however they can, and they decide how to dollarize some weekend at midnight. A lot of improvisation, a lot of errors. And that's why we started to work on this book as back as 2020, because the scenario was Argentina, the economic situation is pushing Argentina to dollarize, and it's going to be an improvisation mess. Let's have something written down that can be used as a guideline. It wasn't expected when we started with the project that Milei will say, I want to dollarize and I want to do it following this book. And then we had to keep working on the proposal and refine it and so on. The risk of waiting is that in between, things can go wrong. What if, because of this pushback that Milei is having in Congress, the market thinks he's not going to be able to balance the budget. Therefore, he's not going to be able to cut down inflation. Therefore, I want to move to the dollar today because I don't believe this crawling peg that he announced is going to be sustainable. And now you have to dollarize in a much worse situation that you had, as bad as it was at the beginning of the government. Because you lose time and you lose that you need to dollarize political capital. All these reforms that he wants to do, they take time to implement and they take time to produce an economic effect for the public to connect to that. He wants to balance the budget by the end of the year. That's 1 year. A lot of things can go wrong in 1 year. And do you have 1 year? Because before you know it, you will have to get ready for midterm elections. If you dollarize, you produce an institutional and an immediate shock to expectations. Inflation starts to go quickly, and you have the political capital because Argentines want the dollars, right? I'm not trying to say, give me the peso that you don't want, and I'm forcing you to use the dollar you don't want. It's the other way, right? You want the dollar, here you go. So you have the political power and the political latitude to implement the other reforms that you had to push forward, like labor reforms, trade reforms, fiscal reforms. But now you are dollarized, so you cannot throw under the carpet your labor market rigidities with inflation and reducing real wages. No, now you have to do the reforms. You have to move forward. And that's the reason why, if you want to do long-lasting reforms, you start with the reforms that are more difficult to reverse, so that your incentive is to keep moving forward. If you start with the labor reform, you undo the reform next month. Argentina changes its laws like nothing. It's not credible, right? And that's an issue with these laws, the omnibus law and the decree that Milei is trying to pass. Okay, but how long is this going to last if the next government can turn it around just as easy? What's the credibility, the long-run credibility of these reforms? Dollarization helps you to build that because now it's not on your benefit to walk back in those reforms. Dollarization is still on the table, either because Milei really wants to dollarize. Maybe he surprises tomorrow and announces dollarization, who knows? But maybe he still wants to do it, so it's in the table. Actually, there was a spike of interest, I think, in the last few days about this. And it's still on the table because even if what he's doing in the economic policy area improves things for some time, if this is not a real long-run solution, 2-3 years down the road, 4 years, 5 years, we'll still be talking again about dollarization. Argentina almost dollarized in the late 1990s. It was very close. It didn't. Here we are again. So when we talk about dollarization, or at least when I talk about dollarization, I'm not thinking about a policy that will last for a few years. I'm thinking about a long-term solution. If you tell me we do this policy and then we talk about dollarization again in 5 years, that's my point. I don't want a policy that only lasts 5 years. That's nothing. It needs something that has a much longer time horizon. I'm not thinking about a short-term, I'm thinking like a long-term solution.
What would it look like if, for example, dollarization was announced, but what would it look like if it was not being done properly?
It depends on what that weakness will look like. You can have issues like Korea. You dollarize and then you elect a new Kirchnerista and he finds a way to seize deposits. He finds a way to, monetize some of his deficit. It will depend on how that weakness looks. But when I think of Argentina, we're not talking about dollarizing Chile or Peru, right? We're talking about dollarizing Argentina. What Argentina needs the most is a strong, credible institutional framework. And if you can credibly provide price stability for any time horizon you can think of, that already is a huge benefit. 2008, Correa is in government in Ecuador, a strong populist. He defaulted the debt, sovereign debt, and we had the 2008 crisis, or 2008-2009. The Ecuadorian risk premium went up, right? You default, 2008 crisis. The prime risk of Ecuador's debt went up a lot. The private sector interest rates, they remain flat. The access to credit in the private sector remained the same. If you are dollarized and you mess up fiscally, you as a government, you pay the cost, but not the private sector. The private sector gets isolated to some extent, an important extent, from government imbalances.
I think that covers all of my questions. So was there any particular point you want to emphasize a bit more, or it sounds like your answers?
I can think right now. I think we talk about a lot of stuff. Dollarization is still on the table, it's still being discussed. I know most of our writing is in Spanish, but I translated many of my Spanish posts into English in my own blog, so you can find some of that there. I have a post where I summarize the steps that we talk about how you dollarize, so you can go back and read that as well. It's a very exciting topic. If Argentina, in fact, dollarizes, it's probably going to be the largest economy to do that, at least in the region. And who knows, it may produce a domino effect in the region and other areas for countries to just connect themselves to the world reserve currency. That will be a major shift in economics.
Nicolás, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
No, thank you for the invitation.
That's it for this episode. For updates about the podcast, please subscribe to our Substack blog found on cpsi.media. You can also read our newsletters and long-form content on Caribbean policy improvements.